We can talk about Joe Manganello. My friend whose last name I can't pronounce. He's like 6'4" and the most handsome person on the planet. Like, he is the ultimate hunk. He's so much of a hunk. He was one of the leads in Magic Mike. Like, you can't get hunkier than that. But here's what we learned in our conversation with Joe. He is a nerd.
And committed.
I, for quite a while, have known that Joe is a Dungeons and Dragons enthusiast. And what that usually means is someone like me or Stephen Colbert, who like played in junior high school, and maybe we have a couple of D&D games in our closet. Joe has the entire downstairs of his home is devoted to D&D. He has a Dungeons and Dragons table.
The biggest table I've ever seen.
It's about 30 feet long, covered with D&D stuff. He has every D&D game that's ever been made. It's a Dungeons and Dragons museum. And he plays Dungeons and Dragons multiple times a week with wonderful random bunch of people. So, Joe.
Yes.
Lindsay.
Yeah.
Bubbles. If I was to describe you to someone, my friend Joe, he's obsessed with Dungeons and Dragons. He's obsessed with like some of the mystical aspects of 12-step programs in Carl Jung. He was a raver in high school. They'd be like, oh, so he's like a little nerd like you. Like, and then they would see you and they'd realize, well, you don't look like a nerd.
What does a nerd look like?
I think you're looking at him. Like, a nerd is me. A nerd is like...
But why does a nerd have to look a certain way? Isn't a nerd... Aren't we describing what someone is on the inside or what they're attracted to?
A lot of nerds felt like we didn't have a choice. Like for example, when we were in school, we were like, well, we're bad at sports. We're not smart enough to really like start computer companies. So... let's go play D&D and listen to electronic music because that was the only thing left available to us.
I don't know that I chose to be a nerd. I just am one. Some of those things are positive. Some of those things are negative. I think when you have a personality like that, you can be very, very attracted to some of the negative aspects in life, and then there's some of the positive aspects in life, and it kind of becomes a struggle between heaven and hell in this whole
Well, it's funny, when
experience.
when I first got sober for real, I noticed a few recurring trends in the meetings I went to. And one of them was like a lot of times people were giving their share about addiction and they were talking about their childhoods. And almost invariably, they talked about losing themselves in books.
Yes.
Like, and a lot of like losing themselves in fantasy. And I was like, oh, well, you mean like reading Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion and drawing maps of my hometown that tried to make it look like J.R.R. Tolkien had drawn them. So it seems like you might have identified as someone who as a child lost yourself in stories and books.
When I reached the point where it was time to get sober and really started looking at why I had such a problem with reality. When I was in high school, I had all kinds of different friends. I was friends with everybody. You know, but it's not to say that on the inside there isn't this
what's really
like aloneness.
interesting
is
that you have all of these communities, these probably tight-knit athletic communities.
Yes.
And yet you still are struggling with this feeling that must have been powerful, but then you also find theater in all of this, and I wonder how
and D&D.
And D&D.
I played a lot of other games as a kid, so it wasn't necessarily D&D. Like, there was a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle role-playing game that took place in modern day.
I would have played that.
So, okay, well, we're these abominations. Where do we belong in this world, and what do we do?
Oh,
and then
I could cry.
That's what I like. But I was a weird kid. You know, looking back, I maybe should have just gone into directing. It was developing storytelling. I get to tell the story for my family members that didn't get to tell their story.
Oh, and also Joe has a really interesting TV show, doesn't he?
Deal or No
Tropics.
Deal Island. And Joe obviously loves games and overseeing games like that. I mean, he's the dungeon master at his home, but he also is the game master for Deal or No Deal Island. It was a joy for me to sit between two dudes just connecting.
Thanks. And I think that's everything.
I think so.
So we'll talk to you soon.